Hi everyone. Today I want to talk to you about a game series that I adore, and a problem that has faced many of the most successful revolutions throughout history. This problem is, how does a revolution that intends to radically shift the social and economic order survive when surrounded by the hostile reactionary forces of the status quo? And how does the ongoing survival of this new revolutionary state stay true to its core beliefs when competing for supremacy against the old order? If you're a Marxist-Leninist or a student of the history of the Russian Revolution and the USSR, then you've probably heard a variant of this topic referred to as the problem of socialism in one country. Shortly after the Russian Revolution, this topic became the source of many disagreements between Trotsky and Stalin, each referring back to their own interpretations of Lenin's opinion on this issue and how to work around it. This problem is also not exclusive to Marxists. Many of the points I will cover also apply to a greater or lesser extent to an anarchist revolution, and there are some examples of this I'll cover later on. Being the only revolutionary force amidst a sea of reactionaries has some obvious problems, but as I'll explain, the most obvious solutions to these obvious problems ends up being to reproduce power structures that are at odds with the goal of creating radical change. In order to better illustrate this topic, I'll be talking about a game series that on the surface maybe doesn't make you think of revolutions. Metal Gear is more well known as a series about spies and giant robots, but as we'll come to see, despite his own denials of an ideological motivation, Big Boss is in fact absolutely a revolutionary, with an ideology based in freedom, equality, and justice. We will also come to see that despite his ideology based in these positive goals, he consistently finds himself in positions that fundamentally conflict with the changes that he desires for the world. In this video, I will be talking about a couple of the games in the Metal Gear series in detail, primarily Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and Peace Walker. I'll also be mentioning parts of Portable Ops, and Metal Gears 1 and 2, and Metal Gear Solid 3. There will be some spoilers. Also, yes, I know about the questions about Big Boss's true identity in Metal Gear Solid 5, but for the purposes of what we're going to be talking about, I'm not going to be getting into that at all, and I'm just going to be calling him Big Boss for simplicity. We're going to be talking most about MGS5 and Peace Walker because these games cover the events wherein Big Boss works to create basically a society outside the existing order. He basically does a revolution. This work includes the creation of the Mother Base, and then the other Mother Base after the first one was destroyed by reactionaries. This society that Big Boss is attempting to create is unique because of its goals and methods, which have a lot more in common with anarchist and communist principles than you might initially imagine. All of this is to say that while on the surface, this private military contractor turned rogue nation may seem more similar to reactionary military fetishism than anything truly left radical, if we examine it a bit deeper, we can find an unmistakable revolutionary ideal behind the actions of Big Boss and his comrades. Now first, it's pretty easy to look at the question, can socialism exist in one country, and come to the seemingly obvious conclusion, yes, it can because it does. I mean, look at China, look at Cuba, look at Vietnam, etc. And yeah, duh, right? But the original debate was not just about if a country created through a revolution under the socialist banner could survive. Survival of the revolution was a big question early on, but as the debates continued and the reality of the USSR as the lone revolutionary state in the 1920s set in, the problem of socialism in one country shifted. The question became not only could a single revolutionary country survive the pressure of the internal and external forces aligned against it, but could that single revolutionary country ever truly realize full socialism while under that pressure? Full socialism can mean many things to many people, but in the case we're discussing, I'll define it as the collective ownership of the means of production by the workers. With the question expanded in this way, the answer to can socialism exist in one country becomes much less obvious. This will be the version of the question that we'll be discussing, since it is much more relevant to the discussion of Metal Gear, and because the answer isn't yes, duh. If we take the question in these terms, I think it's kind of easy to see that no, the effectiveness of these isolated, maybe examples of socialism in bringing about the full intent of socialism within their own borders has fallen a bit short of the mark. In the examples we have, this fundamental point of worker ownership has been watered down to allow for compatibility with capitalist enterprise, or by using the mechanism of the state as a proxy for worker ownership. The thing I want to address here is why that is. Why do our existing and historical examples of isolated socialism trend towards this incomplete socialism? What is it that causes this to happen? And is it something avoidable? To start to answer this, Let's now really turn towards our example, Metal Gear. The first thing we need to discuss is Big Boss's goals. This is important to cover early on, because many of the problems of revolution in one country are not just literal logistical issues as you might imagine, but are actually issues that pit the fundamental principles of the goals of the revolution against tactical, economic, and political realities on the ground. As we'll see, many of the problems that face Big Boss in his endeavors are these same types of pragmatic versus idealistic issues. If you're familiar with Metal Gear, you probably remember numerous times in which Big Boss referred to himself and his work as non-ideological.
We have no nation, no philosophy, no ideology. We go where we're needed, fighting not for country, not for government, but for ourselves. We need no reason to fight. We fight because we are needed. We will be the deterrent for those with no other recourse. We are soldiers without borders, our purpose defined by the era we live in.
Big Boss is definitely not actually non-ideological, and as we'll get into in depth, the very idea of a non-ideological army with a non-ideological strongman leader and a non-ideological conflict with both the USSR and the USA is obviously absurd. Rather than being motivated by the ideological texts of an old German guy, Big Boss finds his purpose in the words of his former mentor, the boss.
I could see the planet as it appeared from space. That's when it finally hit me. Space exploration is nothing but another game in the power struggle between the US and the USSR. Politics, economics, the arms race, they're all just arenas for meaningless competition. I'm sure you can see that, but the Earth itself has no boundaries. No East, no West, no Cold War. And the irony of it is, the United States and the Soviet Union are spending billions on their space programs and the missile race, only to arrive at the same conclusion. In the 21st century, everyone will be able to see that we are all just inhabitants of a little celestial body called Earth. A world without communism or capitalism, that is the world I wanted to see. But reality continued to betray me.
Essentially, the boss expresses her desire for a world without the national, economic, and ideological borders as they currently exist. Beyond this, we don't get a lot of clear political ideas out of the boss before Big Boss is forced to kill her as part of his government-assigned mission. As time passed and Big Boss's understanding of what the boss wanted for the world evolved, he often expressed these ideas in conversations with his trusted second-in-command, Kaz Miller. Kaz expands on the problem of capitalism and communism that the boss originally mentioned.
Costa Rica isn't alone. All of Latin America is getting swept up in the superpowers' Cold War. The whole ideological split between East and West. In the end, it's just a greedy scramble for wealth by the ruling classes. The Western bourgeois stand to lose everything if their countries go communist. After all, the communists want to abolish private property altogether. So the capitalist rulers desperately tried to halt the global spread of communism, hence the phenomenon of red baiting. And the communists, for their part, didn't exactly stay true to their principles. They tried to escape class-based society, but between Stalin's autocracy and the rise of the nomenklatura, they ended up creating one anyway. Once people have power, they stop caring about equality. That's where communism, where society in general reaches its limits. The rulers only care about their own gain. The opposing side becomes a risk factor that threatens the profit, and thus the ongoing struggle between capitalism and communism was born.
And now, nuclear deterrence is part of the picture.
Exactly.
Capitalism and communism are then problems because they are ideologies that inflict domination of the powerful upon the masses, with communism becoming an implement of domination due to its failure to stay true to the principles of a classless society. The boss also described the way in which nations and ideologies force soldiers to accept their capricious definition of who their enemies are, thereby manipulating them into actions like having to kill their former comrades. The boss experienced this manipulation firsthand when she was ordered to execute her former comrade and lover, and then later when she was killed by Big Boss under similar circumstances. Based on all this, we can arrive at two distinct goals. 1. A world without borders, ideologies of domination, and nations. And 2. The end of the manipulation of soldiers by people in positions of political or economic power. To achieve these goals, Big Boss intends to use the strength of his army without borders to challenge the dominating powers that have split the world.
Exactly. We know only how to fight, but we refuse to live our lives at the whim of the state. The MSF seal is patterned after Pangaea, the supercontinent from 250 million years ago. Back then, the whole world was one landmass, one world. No gaps, no rifts.
Our strength will take us back there.
From this, we can see that when Big Boss or Kaz says that they intend to be non-ideological, and Big Boss especially does say this a lot, what they really mean is that their ideology exists outside of the binary of capitalism versus communism and of East versus West.
運営は俺に任せればいい。あんたが望む主義も思想も国境も越えた軍隊。一緒に作ろう。戦う者の理想郷を、あんたが望む理想郷を。国境もなき軍隊。
So obviously, this army without borders, this home for those who fight, isn't bereft of all ideology whatsoever. In fact, as with most media, these games are steeped in ideology. Big Boss and Kaz, despite what they may say, are no exception. And yes, gamers, something can be ideological even if someone in the text says it isn't. Also, everything is ideological. So please don't comment and tell me that Big Boss says it isn't ideological. I'm begging you. So now that we've established that these guys do in fact have an ideology, a system of ideas and ideals, especially ones which form the basis of economic or political theory and policy, I'm going to get into how they intend and tried to put these ideas into practice. Here is where the real issues start to come in. Because while a lot of what Big Boss and Kaz say about creating a place for soldiers to live free of ideological manipulation and a world without borders might sound nice, the methods that they undertake to reach those goals present inescapable contradictions. The first question that they need to answer, since it represents the first step in any of their work, is how do they get people to be on their side? Specifically, how do you create an army while trying to stick to the idea of freeing soldiers from oppressive power structures of manipulation? Throughout MGS5 and Peace Walker, it is not very well explained how exactly Big Boss somehow turns enemy combatants into extremely loyal soldiers in such a reliable and speedy way, since his primary method of recruitment is basically kidnapping. It doesn't make much sense to claim the moral high ground against nations that recruit through propaganda and manipulation, but still ostensibly allow people to join of their own free will. The mainline games make some reference to this issue.
Start bringing people in. Use this. It's a Fulton recovery device. When you're in the field, use it to extract any soldiers or prisoners you want back here. And we'll see if we can't persuade them to join the ranks of Diamond Dogs.
But to find an example of exactly how this works, we need to look outside the main series, to Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops.
Quick thinker, too. They trained you well. You're a good soldier.
Will you join us? You're here to save us, and you want me to help you defeat Gene. What's so funny? You think he's been brainwashed? Brainwashed? Is that what you think is happening here? That's why we follow him, not you. You'll never be able to stop him.
Justice, huh? The meaning of justice can change from one day to the next. A professional soldier never brings justice into the mission. The only ones who need a reason to fight are the ones who fight for a living. That's what my mentor told me.
Your mentor? The one who taught you the art of battle? Who was she?
They called her the boss. I killed her.
The boss? The legendary soldier? And Snake? You must be Big Boss. You're the hero who killed Colonel Volgin at Groznygrad. Prove your loyalty as a soldier. That's what the boss told me. I still don't know what she meant. Prove your loyalty. Not to justice, not to your country, but to yourself. I know it's hard to believe. No, I believe you. Not as a member of the Red Army, but as a soldier. I appreciate it. I will follow you. Snake, give me my mission.
As we can see here, Big Boss's strategy consists of convincing them. We can interpret this as Big Boss respecting the inherent autonomy of each person, which is basically an anarchist way of looking at recruitment. To quote a similar idea from anarchist author Enrico Malatesta, it would be ridiculous and contrary to our objectives to seek to impose freedom, love among men, and the radical development of human faculties by means of force. One must therefore rely on the free will of others, and all we can do is to provoke the development and the expression of the will of the people. By recruiting without the coercive power of nationalism or money, Big Boss is displaying his belief in the necessity for autonomy of the individual soldier. His soldiers would not be manipulated carelessly as the political winds change, but would instead choose to fight based upon as unclouded a view as possible. But obviously, if your goal is for the entire world to drastically change politically, you won't be able to convince everyone. There will be resistance, especially from the oppressors who stand to lose position and power. To answer this issue, let's finish the previous quote from Malatesta. But it would be equally absurd and contrary to our aims to admit that those who do not share our views should prevent us from expressing our will, so long as it does not deny them the same freedom. Freedom for all, therefore, to propagate and to experiment with their ideas, with no other limitation than that which arises naturally from the equal liberty of everybody. Big Boss's methods represent the same synthesis of strategy that Malatesta proposed, applied to an individual. That to allow someone to remain in thrall to a manipulative oppressor is not truly permitting their freedom, but to attempt to simply replace their current oppressor with ourselves betrays our goals. That instead, we should free the people from their oppression, and then present convincing, egalitarian, and true principles to bring their thinking in line with ours, while we also resist all oppressive forces aimed against us. While this method of recruitment does seem in line with Big Boss's principles, it proves difficult to sustain these same principles at the larger scales of his operation. If we take Big Boss's principle of respecting the individual autonomy of his soldiers to its logical conclusion, then we would end up with basically an anarchist army. While there are examples of anarchist armies in history, their successes when confronted by their authoritarian counterparts have always been short-lived. Many have said that this is either due to bad luck, a small sample size, or factors unrelated to their organizational structure. While it is possible that this is true, it's hard to argue that the standard model of hierarchically strict, centrally managed armed forces hasn't proven itself quite effective. As stated by Chris Day in his text, The Historical Failures of Anarchism, there is a reason that the world is dominated by regular armies with unified command structures. It is not because the states of the world simply find their authoritarian form more agreeable in spite of its comparative military inefficiencies. If that were so, states would be constantly striving to obtain the benefits of decentralism in military matters, as they sometimes do in other matters in which decentralism is in fact more efficient. But the military remains the most centralized institution in any society. Its authoritarianism the model by which less authoritarian institutions are judged. If we accept this premise of the efficiency of hierarchical command structures in military matters, as we will see that Big Boss and Kaz have, then we must admit a core contradiction between method and ideology. Big Boss wants soldiers to be free from exploitation and ideology, but he requires totally compliant soldiers for his goals, therefore also requiring them to submit to his will and ideology. Even if he treats them better and has more respect for their autonomy, a good boss is still a boss. During the Spanish Civil War, the anarchist forces attempted to get around this same ideological contradiction with a number of reforms, like the election of officers and removing differences in social status between the ranks. But to quote Chris Day again, these things can't hide the fundamentally authoritarian nature of an army. Absolute subordination to the command structure, drills that psychologically prepare soldiers to take orders, the suspension of basic democratic rights in the course of military engagements, and so on. Although we've seen that Big Boss has some belief in individual autonomy and a disdain for authoritarians, his army does not reflect these beliefs as well as you might hope. For starters, Mother Base still has a brig where soldiers who misbehave are imprisoned. Bad behavior can also net a soldier punishments like more shifts scrubbing the decks.
Boss, we don't draw weapons on comrades.
You two. You just earned yourself a week in the brig. Deck cleaning duty by day.
No, wait. You've got some blood to pay me back for first.
While these are standard methods for punishment for most any army, they do indicate that Big Boss's army is not entirely voluntary. His position of power over them is enforced by a monopoly on punishment, violence, that he is able to use to keep his subordinates in line. This means that despite the apparent mutual respect between Big Boss and his soldiers, his attempts to endear himself to them, and his care for their well-being, he still places himself in a position above them where in combat situations, he ultimately decides who will most likely live and who will die. He makes exactly that decision when a group of his soldiers are infected with a highly contagious disease, and he reluctantly kills all of them to prevent their escape and the disease spreading.
Boss! Boss! Hey! Let's let the boss decide. We live and die by your order, boss. Boss!
This is a very blunt example of this, but this same type of decision would have to be made by Big Boss and his subordinate commanders all the time. Choosing which soldiers go on missions and which missions to take requires a calculation of risk and reward, with human lives always hanging in the balance. This is his compromise. As a soldier, he sees no way to reach his goals without an army, and despite his past bad experiences with authoritarian top-down military structures, he chooses to retain this same structure for his own organization. Even if we concede that Big Boss has good intentions, from the perspective of the exploited, this Big Boss seems very much the same as the old boss. While he can say that his army is different because of what they believe in, their structural similarities to all the other armies in the world mean that their beliefs are not shaping their form. Their form, based upon that which Big Boss believes is most effective, tends towards the same authoritarian structures as their enemies. What Big Boss fails to see or chooses to ignore is that the exploitation of soldiers by ideologies and nationalities is a consequence of armies' authoritarian structure, instead of just a bad behavior that corrupts an otherwise good system. Furthermore, Big Boss's use of this structure leads him to reproduce the same authoritarian behaviors that he wants to see destroyed. That tactical consideration winning out against moral reservations is only one example out of many. With his anarchist army, Big Boss has secured a method of defending himself and his plans from the military intervention of his enemies abroad. But what about enemies within? Throughout Big Boss's attempts to create a new way of life for soldiers, he is forced to contend with that oldest enemy of the revolutionary, the spy. If we skip ahead and look at Big Boss's attempts at creating a place for soldiers with no country, 3 out of 4 of them were destroyed or defeated directly as a result of infiltration or betrayal. Starting at the beginning with Peace Walker, Big Boss is very willing to accept new comrades, build alliances with other revolutionaries, and conduct mutual aid operations with those that he shares common cause. His work alongside Paz Ortega Andrade, the Sandinistas, and Huey Emmerich all occurred during this period of open cooperation. He used his Army Without Borders on multiple occasions to confound the plans of the superpowers meddling in Latin and South America, advancing his goals of their defeat while assisting those that were trying to escape domination. He allowed his comrades to guide his goals and help determine his program. But unfortunately, this would not last. He was first betrayed by Paz, who was revealed as a triple agent working with the forces of reaction, the CIA, the KGB, and the shadowy organization Cypher, as they attempted to frame Big Boss for a nuclear strike on Cuba. Another betrayal occurred when, after Big Boss and Huey disagreed on the necessity of bringing nuclear weapons onto Mother Base as a deterrent against attack, Huey went behind Big Boss's back to schedule a nuclear inspection of Mother Base by the UN. This inspection was then used as cover by Big Boss's enemies to stage an attack on Mother Base, leading to the destruction of the first Mother Base and the death of nearly all of the soldiers serving under Big Boss there. These betrayals marked a turning point in Big Boss's perspective surrounding new allies. Going forward, his inner circle of allies that helped him run his operations shrank down to only his most trusted comrades, with paranoia becoming an unfortunately reasonable precaution.
What if she's a spy?
What if I'm a spy? Or you?
While the paranoia surrounding betrayal by duplicitous saboteurs is clearly rational given these events, the way that Big Boss handles dissent against his decisions is where serious problems arise. Huey is the perfect example of this. Whereas Paz represents the threat of traitorous reactionary spies, Huey represents the hazard of internal dissension among leadership. Huey doesn't act against Big Boss in order to harm him or Mother Base. On the contrary, his intent is to try to protect everyone from what he sees as the existential threat posed to them by retaining nuclear weapons. Huey acts in a self-directed way to do what he thought was morally and tactically right, and the destruction his actions caused was in fact due to Huey himself being betrayed and used as a pawn by outside forces taking advantage of this dissent. Big Boss's anger with Huey undoubtedly originates in the death and destruction that occurred as a result of his decision to invite the inspectors, but it is then conflated with the fact that Huey also directly disobeyed the boss. If we consider a hypothetical alternate scenario where Big Boss approves of the inspectors and Huey was duped, but otherwise still following orders, Huey probably wouldn't have been held responsible, and he'd still likely be in Big Boss's good graces. Primarily, the problem is that Huey disobeyed an order. This illustrates a clear central hierarchy in the operation of Mother Base. For all their talk of wanting to escape from the coercive power of self-interested hierarchies over soldiers, Big Boss finds himself at the lead of exactly that same structure. Centralizing power became Big Boss's only option once tactical and ideological disagreements were no longer perceived as being solvable by discussion. Big Boss's response to the threat of spies and saboteurs has plenty of precedent. If we look at Kaz's earlier complaints about the USSR with the rise of the nomenclatura, Stalin's authoritarianism, and the failure to create a classless society, we can see he in fact predicted a situation similar to that of Mother Base right at this point. To quote Kaz,
"Once people have power, they stop caring about equality. That's where communism, where society in general reaches its limits. The rulers only care about their own gain. The opposing side becomes a risk factor that threatens the profit."
But if Kaz and Big Boss are aware of this limit on society that takes effect once people have power, why then do we see them adopting similar authoritarian tactics? The answer comes down to two things. One is that Big Boss and his compatriots see their goals as the most important thing to consider in any equation, instead of considering the equal importance of the methods they will use to reach those goals. Two is the belief in a singular path to reach that goal, a path defined by a singular executive power. While it's not really fair to say that Big Boss doesn't care about equality, it is clear that whatever care he has for it is overridden by his need to remain in power so he can reach his goals. There are many similar examples throughout history of revolutionaries seizing singular executive power over the state with the expressed interest of reaching some positive socialist goal. The examples of anyone actually carrying this promise out are considerably fewer. But this isn't just a consequence of people who gain power becoming corrupt and greedy like Kaz implies. When your goals include things like building complete socialism and the ability to defend your revolution against reaction from both within and without, then it's easy to spend a lifetime going after these goals and still never quite getting there. Like Kaz, we can be cynical and say that the centralizing changes common to most socialist revolutions were never anything more than just unjustifiable mad grabs for power. But if we're perhaps a bit more generous, we might see this instead as the natural consequence of a serious disconnect between intent and method. When you decide that your strategy is the only way to achieve the revolution's shared goal, then any dissent regarding methods necessarily becomes an obstacle, and cooperation an impossibility. From the outside, it's then very easy to mark this revolution down as just another where the leaders got greedy and fooled the people, because the methods appear identical. Without a look into the black box of the minds of men like Big Boss, we have no way to know whether we should believe that they're simply dedicated to stop at nothing for their cause, or that they're greedy liars who just want power. In either case, the results, and often the rhetoric, appear identical. The shrinking of Big Boss's inner circle after the first mother base was destroyed mirrors the post-revolutionary constrictions of power within many different socialist revolutions, and with the same motivation: the necessity of continuing their work to reach their goal, along the path that they have determined is correct. The argument for this necessity allowed Big Boss, and many other revolutionaries throughout history, to ignore the contradictions of restricting power in an authoritarian manner, despite the obvious betrayal of their principles that this course of action represented. Now, with the two most pressing issues addressed, the threat of literal destruction by outside and inside forces, we can turn to a less violent problem. As basically an island of metal in the middle of the ocean, both versions of Mother Base must deal with an obvious question: where's the food gonna come from? And not just the food. The guns, the bullets, the clothes, the tanks. Mother Base and its soldiers have a lot of needs. Mother Base does have some processing ability to turn raw materials into these things, but they still need to get those raw materials first. For this, they have to rely on the outside world. While Mother Base is an extreme example, as it has literally no natural resources, this same situation has been true of all revolutionary attempts throughout recent history. There are two reasons for this. One is that there is basically no place in the world with enough naturally occurring resources to satisfy all possible needs, especially when we take into consideration resources that have become more or less required for modern production in the last century, like rare earth metals, petroleum, etc. Second is that the past few hundred years of capitalism and colonialism dominating the world have resulted in a global economy that, by design, disincentivizes and outcompetes local self-sufficiency. With supply chains intentionally routed throughout the globe to minimize costs and maximize profits, it's incredibly difficult to compete or even survive once your links to that chain are cut. It leaves you with a lot more of certain things than you might need, but a lot fewer of other things that you can no longer import. Because of this, even if a nation decides to proclaim its intention to free itself from capitalism and to shake off the systems of exploitation, as Big Boss desires, this is so much easier said than done. When a sudden drive for self-reliance fails to match the needs of the nation, and it frequently has, the results are shortages and mass famines. Even if you are able to successfully break away immediately, it isn't very easy to spin up the factories to continue producing the guns and tanks that you need to defend yourself from invasion or rebellion by the reactionaries. As I mentioned, Mother Base's situation necessitates reliance upon outside production, and if we consider this fact in the context of Big Boss's revolutionary ideals, we can see another conflict. Generally, Mother Base has two methods of bringing in resources: missions and appropriation. The missions that Mother Base takes on are funded by various nations and organizations, including those like the CIA and KGB, and by extension, the USA and USSR. Especially once Militaires Sans Frontières are transformed into the Diamond Dogs following the destruction of the first Mother Base, Big Boss is not picky about where his money is coming from.
The world calls for wet work, and we answer. No greater good. No just cause.
Big Boss also just captures resources from the organizations he's fighting against. Resources which were produced by nations that are experiencing the worst of capitalist exploitation, with literal children digging up the diamonds that Big Boss needs to fund his operation. Additionally, Big Boss's use of coercive power over his soldiers means they're being exploited in much the same way as any worker, with the threat of imprisonment in the brig, or worse if they don't follow orders and help to generate the resources that Mother Base needs. At their core, these methods of retrieving resources rely on either money from exploitative nations or the literal exploitation of the working class in his own micronation. Big Boss acknowledges that if these methods of retrieving resources ever dried up, he would be unable to continue his operations.
People point at the nuclear arms and space races and call it a Cold War. I say if they're not shooting at each other, why not call it world peace?
Doesn't mean war is gone. Look at Korea. Look at Vietnam.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking in relative terms here. Besides, if war died out completely, we'd be SOL.
We're not warmongers.
And yet, we can't survive in a world that's at peace.
You got a point.
Because of his lack of resource independence, he is required to rely on the world systems of domination that he so despises. This is not just, oh, you say you hate capitalism, but you have a cell phone. This is more, Oh, you say you hate the dominating power of the state, but you're employing it as a primary method of coercion both at home and abroad for your own ends, at the cost of the workers and soldiers. The compromise that Big Boss has accepted here is that exploitation is effective, and you must be effective in order to compete and survive. Therefore, you must be exploitative.
What about you guys? Any interest in expanding MSF?
You'd better believe it. I want to make us into an organization that doesn't take orders from any country. Just like you were saying, we have to be strong. Strong enough to defend ourselves. We need money, too. Money to train soldiers to fight. Combining the small footprint and exceptional performance of special forces with the raw military might of a full regular army. Only with that kind of power can we break free of nation-states.
Like the centralized hierarchies of armies, the short to medium-term effectiveness of exploiting the working class locally and internationally is by and large proven by its prevalence on the world stage. The questions of the morality and long-term viability of these types of actions have often been easily brushed aside by leaders when the stakes are the failure or success of their nation or revolution. Therefore, we see Big Boss enjoying the fruits of the exploitative system of world power, whether it be by payments received when performing operations or by direct appropriation of resources, while at the same time his ultimate goal is to end that very system. This attempted compromise has presented itself in most of the revolutionary countries of the past couple centuries, resulting in would-be or should-be socialist economies employing all the same methods of exploitation that they ideologically denounce. What this looks like, in practice, is a country like the USSR exploiting their own working class in order to compensate for reduced access to the production of the international exploited working class. This is the conflict of interest inherent in trying to compete with the capitalist world economy. In the existing neoliberal world order, exploitation of some workers, somewhere, is the cost of doing business. For states that never actually intended to provide economic and political freedom to their people, this is an easy compromise. But for states that do intend these big changes, this is a fundamental betrayal of their core intent, relying on domination and exploitation with the promise that it will eventually lead to victory over the dominators and exploiters, at which point the new masters will loosen their grip. In the 1920s, the victors of the recent Russian Revolution, expecting socialist revolutions throughout many other European nations, were shocked to find their compatriot revolutions defeated, and themselves the lone revolutionary socialist power in the world at the time. In the following years, through a series of policy decisions aimed at preserving their own revolution, they gave ground on idealism to realpolitik, and in the process made use of means that ran contrary to their goals. If it were only them that this happened to, we could chalk this up to failures in their particular decisions and judgment, but these compromises appear in other socialist revolutions far too consistently to be coincidence. In addition, anarchist revolutions, though fewer and shorter-lived, have had to contend with the problem of an anarchist army, with no ultimately successful configuration having yet been devised. Throughout the long and incredibly convoluted path of Big Boss through Metal Gear, these same conflicts of ends versus means are always present, each ending with predictable results. This isn't to say that the goals and tactics of all these real-world revolutions were always inherently faulty and doomed to collapse or betray their ideals. Instead, I would argue that when well-intentioned revolutionary efforts are faced with the overwhelming military, political, and economic might of a capitalist world system, the options so far used in historical precedent are extremely limited. In most cases, the options have been to either die alongside your revolution with your morals uncompromised, or to give ground to the status quo so that you can keep living with the hope that you may see your ideas become reality somewhere down the road. To characterize the failures of these revolutionary histories as simple moral failures on the part of individuals, as simple cases of the corrupting effect of power, is incomplete and unhelpful if we're seeking practical solutions. If that were the case, and all we really needed was a really great and morally righteous leader who will never compromise their own morals, well, then we're going to be waiting a very long time for our perfect, untarnishable vanguard. Also, if staunchness of belief alone was enough to outfight all armies, outmaneuver all spies, and outproduce all capitalists, then the brave efforts of our revolutionary forebears would have certainly achieved their victory long ago. The question isn't, can socialism or anarchism or communism exist in one country, but can any of these ideas realistically compete from a position of relative disadvantage with systems that are bereft of a moral character by design? whose success on the world stage are defined by the completeness of their rapaciousness and cruelty. In order to survive when outnumbered in these conditions, revolutionaries have often traded justice for exploitation in order to compete in a rigged game. So then, if the failure does not entirely lie with individual actors within these revolutions, who were faced with no good options, where does the solution lie? For Leon Trotsky, the solution to the problem of socialism in one country was to ensure an international revolution in the most developed or advanced countries. In an isolated proletarian dictatorship, the internal and external contradictions grow inevitably along with the successes achieved. If it remains isolated, the proletarian state must finally fall victim to these contradictions. The way out for it lies only in the victory of the proletariat of the advanced countries. In his estimation, if enough of the most powerful nations in the world transitioned to a socialist mode, they could effectively combat the military, economic, and political threat posed to them by the remaining capitalist powers. Though at the time it was theorized by some, like Stalin, that the USSR could survive on its own in the long term and build a real socialist state, the historical reality proved this to be untrue. If we expand on the problem of this isolation, we see that it is not exclusive to Russia, and not exclusive to socialists either. Even anarchist revolutions must contend with the reality of defending against authoritarian armies, spies, provocateurs, and the question of how to ensure production commensurate with their survival without the use of exploitation. Big Boss faced the same problem that all the revolutions I just listed have had to contend with. How do you compete with and defeat exploitation without employing it yourself? This problem is the most severe when the revolution is entirely isolated, as in the case of Russia in the first quarter of the 20th century, and as with Big Boss's mother base. Widespread and interconnected revolutions that are not under constant military threat and that do not rely on production from the exploitative world economy would be able to far more easily put their intended means into action, with no period of temporarily accepting vanguardist domination. But it's not just that a world revolution would have an easier time. I would also agree with Trotsky that in a world without a global revolution, any isolated revolution surrounded by capitalist imperialist states would in the long term face contradictions that would lead either to its inevitable defeat via collapse or reintegration into the capitalist economy. I believe that the revolution attempted by Big Boss, for a stateless, classless, global society of equals, exposes this reality very clearly. While Big Boss's goals are in direct opposition to any kind of state or nation, it's obvious, even from the very beginning, that the only tactical options for defense that he considered valid necessarily involved the creation of a social structure that would result in the elevation of him and his inner circle to rulers. Then, from the position of rulers, they were forced to continue expanding these tactical measures to the point that their initial intentions and values were completely compromised. Because of Big Boss's decision to create an army, to form a hierarchical command structure, and to conduct economic relations with the outside world, he ensured that his methods would have to remain in contradiction to his goals up until the point of an absolute military victory against every state in the world that opposed him. With no realistic hope of achieving said absolute military victory, Big Boss's goals are effectively reduced to nothing more than finding a method of survival amidst a sea of enemies.
Mission complete, boss.
It's easy and fun to just say Trotsky was right, and that the solution to the problem of revolution in one country is just, duh, do the revolution everywhere. But as I hope I've explained here, any revolution that does not incapacitate the imperialist nations will face the virtual certainty of military attack, sabotage, and a well-funded counter-revolution. Additionally, a lone anarchist or socialist revolution will be unable to compete head-to-head against the economic power of nations that make use of domination and exploitation of the poor of the world, unless they too engage in those same mechanisms of domination and exploitation. While the possibility of a world revolution is daunting, we're fortunate in current times to have numerous advantages that they didn't during revolutions a century ago. Greater capacity for instant communication, decentralized platforms for spreading messages to the widest possible audience, and easy access to all recorded knowledge of past revolutionaries puts us in as good a position as anyone in history. Additionally, while capitalist imperialism might currently be entrenched in power over essentially the entire world, it's also revealed itself as unable to adapt to the certainty that infinite growth can never exist with finite resources. The idea that it will be able to indefinitely and sustainably continue its domination despite pushing the world into a spiral of accelerating ecological crises is frankly laughable. As we've seen, numerous issues exist for any attempt to resist the prevailing political and economic systems of the world. Fortunately, we have a breadth of examples of how these problems arise and can be dealt with. Unfortunately, so many of these examples illustrate a simple problem. The ideals of the left are at their most vulnerable in situations when they're exposed to the violent and oppressive logic of the systems that currently dominate the world. If these systems are not smashed on local, national, and international levels, then any revolution, no matter how well-intentioned, may be doomed before it even starts. El Rico. If I even tried, I would look like such a baby.
Let me look it up really quick.
El Rico.
Let me look it up really quick.
El Rico.
Let me look it up really quick.
Okay, sorry, I'm just fucking with you, dude. Sorry.